Tonight, we slip past the obsidian walls of Tenochtitlán into chambers the history books rarely describe. This is not a story of battles and conquests. It is a story of power shared in whispers, of alliances sealed in the dark, and of intimacy that was never private. For the Aztec elite, sex was not just pleasure. It was politics, ritual, and a cosmic duty. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a vast stone hall alive with incense and torchlight. The air is heavy with the smell of copal and sweat. Cotton tapestries sway in the night breeze while moonlight cuts across murals of gods and serpents. In this palace, every glance, every embrace, every whispered promise is watched by ancestors and divinities. Here, intimacy is both sacred and dangerous. Unlike our modern idea of love and marriage, the Aztecs viewed unions like generals planning campaigns. The emperor, known as the Huey did not simply marry for affection. He married for empire. Each wife was a treaty, each child a potential ambassador. Dozens of women were brought into his household, not as symbols of romance, but as political anchors. Imagine the weight of balancing 30 marriages, each tied to a region, a clan, or a priesthood that expected loyalty in return. The palace bedchamber was a map of empire, drawn not in ink but in flesh and blood. Yet, beneath the political strategies lay something even deeper. The Aztecs believed that human bodies carried tonali, a sacred energy given by the gods. Sexual union was a way of realigning that energy with the cosmos. For a royal couple, their intimacy wasn't private. It was a performance of cosmic balance. Each act was thought to strengthen the empire itself, reaffirming the order of sun, moon, and stars. The emperor's chamber looked luxurious, but it was also unsettling. Feathered blankets, red-dyed cotton, and reed mats were arranged with care. Yet incense burners shaped like gods and blades near the altar reminded everyone that pleasure here was never far from sacrifice. For royalty, duty and desire were inseparable. At least in theory, Aztec rulers were expected to live with discipline. But in practice, power often rewrote the rules. Moctezuma, for example, kept so many concubines that even the scandal-hardened Spanish were shocked. Some historians argue that Spanish chroniclers exaggerated these tales to justify conquest, but others suggest the accounts may have understated reality. Oral traditions even describe rituals in which emperors engaged in sacred unions during solar eclipses, acts believed to help reignite the sun itself. The consequences of misstep, however, were deadly. A noble caught in the wrong affair risked execution. For commoners, even looking with desire at a royal consort could lead to death, sometimes in brutal public ceremonies meant to warn others. In Aztec society, desire was a flame carefully controlled, and the cost of slipping was steep. What strikes us today is how completely sexuality was woven into every layer of Aztec life. Fertility was tied to harvests. Pleasure was linked to cosmic cycles. To lie with the emperor, or even to bear his child, was to participate in maintaining the universe itself. Sweat, blood, and seed were not metaphors. They were literal offerings to the gods. Nothing was trivial. Even queerness found a complicated space in this world. Deities like Xochipilli, the god of flowers and pleasure, embodied both beauty and same-sex desire. Although society placed restrictions on such expressions, their presence in the pantheon showed that sexuality, in all its forms, was considered part of divine design. As you walk through the palace halls in your imagination, you realize sex here was never a matter of choice. It was duty, an obligation to gods, ancestors, and empire. The royal body was a vessel through which heaven and earth met, and the palace itself, filled with mirrors, shadows, and whispers, was less a home and more a stage where cosmic order was continuously reenacted. Now, follow the sound of soft sandals brushing stone. Down a corridor lined with obsidian mirrors, each reflecting faces of countless wives, you see how polygamy wasn't luxury, it was necessity. For Aztec royalty, one wife was never enough. Each marriage was another knot in the web of empire, binding allies and rivals alike. The emperor's marriages created threads of loyalty across the land. Daughters of rulers, priests, and merchants alike were woven into his household. Their dowries included not just gifts but entire villages, land, and sacred treasures. These women were not chosen for beauty alone, but for the power they brought. Only the principal wife, often of equally royal blood, held the highest rank. She was the one whose children stood the greatest chance of inheriting. Life inside this network of wives was not a gentle romance. Each woman had her own chamber, her own servants, and her own rotation. It was a carefully managed system, closer to a bureaucracy than a love story. Jealousies simmered. Rivalries grew. Some whispered curses over clay dolls. Others poisoned rivals in the shadows. To be wife number 17 meant surviving a court of daggers hidden in smiles. And yet, for all its harshness, some women found ways to wield power. A clever concubine could win influence by bearing sons, by outmaneuvering rivals, or by gaining the emperor's ear at the right moment. Though traded like treasures, these women could still reshape politics from within. Not every union was about endless childbearing. Aztec women knew methods of spacing pregnancies, herbal remedies, maize silk, and even extended breastfeeding. Knowledge of birth control was quietly passed among women, especially when palace politics made more children dangerous. But was there love in all this? Surprisingly, yes. Hidden within the strict rituals, some unions grew into genuine affection. We forget that these weren't just symbols of state. They were real people who laughed, cried, and longed for comfort. But affection had to be kept quiet, hidden beneath the eyes of rivals and priests. Even love itself became a careful performance. Step further into the palace gardens. Cacti bloom, hummingbirds dart like sparks of color, and you see how exhausting this life must have been. To the outside world, the emperor stood as the sun itself. But within these walls, he was a man surrounded by endless duties, expectations, and watchful eyes. Dozens of wives might warm his nights, but each dawn he stood alone, carrying the weight of an empire that demanded even the shape of his private life. As the air thickens with incense and the murmur of chanting rises, you realize you've reached the next chamber of palace life. This is where maidens of the temples lived, girls trained from childhood to embody purity and divine service. But purity in this empire was never simple, and here in the House of Maidens, even vows of chastity were woven with secrets. The palace garden gives way to a quieter courtyard. Orchids hang from stone arches, vines curl along walls, and at the center stands a small circular shrine. A single priestess keeps watch, her eyes lowered, her presence more warning than welcome. This is the house of the sacred maidens. On the surface, their life seems simple. Virgins devoted to gods, untouched and cloistered. They were chosen young, often plucked from noble families and raised to embody purity. Inside these temple schools, they learned ritual chants, weaving, and silence. Their hair was braided a certain way, their meals plain and measured. They were meant to be vessels of divine perfection, living symbols of untouchable virtue. But the truth was more complicated. In practice, the temple walls did not always protect innocence. Whispers spread of secret liaisons between maidens and high-ranking nobles. And when those whispers grew too loud, the consequences were brutal. A single mistake could mean public execution, her blood offered in the name of cleansing the temple. Her lover, if he was powerful, might escape. If not, he might face flaying, his skin worn as a warning. Yet, some of these encounters weren't accidents. They were orchestrated. Fertility rituals sometimes demanded that a maiden be symbolically wed to a god. A nobleman, masked and dressed as the deity, would perform the union. To onlookers, it was divine ceremony. To the girl, it was surrender disguised as holiness. Historians argue whether these divine marriages were rare exceptions or far more common than records admit. Spanish accounts, colored by their own biases, describe excess and corruption. Indigenous traditions, however, suggest these rituals were cloaked in secrecy, half hidden even from those within the palace. Imagine being one of these maidens. Your whole life drilled into ritual, silence, and obedience. Then one night, you are dressed in feathers and flowers, perfumed with resin, and told you are the bride of a god. A masked man enters, reciting words in a voice that is not his own. You cannot speak. You cannot refuse. You lie back, knowing that in the morning you may either return to the temple, vanish into exile, or fade from history altogether. Not all maidens suffered this fate. Many lived their entire lives untouched, serving as weavers, singers, and caretakers of temples. Some became revered elders, guiding the next generation. Others eventually married into noble households after years of service. But whether untouched or not, their lives carried a constant pressure. They lived inside a cage of gold and silence, where every rumor could destroy them. Even their rituals carried strange contradictions. One involved bathing at dawn in freezing mountain springs to invite the rain god's blessing. Priests often watched these ceremonies, claiming to ensure correctness. But to the maidens, it was surveillance disguised as sanctity. Their lives were devotion, but also danger, their bodies symbols of perfection that could never truly exist. Step away now from their cloistered courtyard and follow the guarded path to the residence of someone far more visible, the emperor's principal wife. She is not hidden. She is the favored one, the woman whose presence shapes the rhythm of palace life. Her title was Siwakotl, and her status was unmatched. Almost always, she was of pure royal descent, often a cousin or half-sister of the emperor. This kept the bloodline divine and the power tightly bound. While the emperor had dozens of wives, only she could produce heirs with truly unbroken celestial legitimacy. Her children were destined to inherit more than land. They inherited the empire's sacred right to rule. But being the favorite was not simply about noble blood. It was survival, influence, and constant vigilance. Her days began before dawn with prayers, audiences with stewards, and rituals that reminded everyone of her importance. She mediated disputes between wives, calmed jealousies, and kept order in the palace. She was not just a wife. She was a strategist, a quiet general in a war fought with whispers instead of swords. Her influence was subtle but powerful. She could sway decisions by whispering in the emperor's ear before council meetings. She could shift the balance of favor among priests, nobles, or even generals. No decree bore her name, yet her shadow stretched across the empire. But her power was fragile. A younger wife who bore a son could rise quickly, threatening her dominance. Alliances shifted like the stars. At any moment, accusations of witchcraft or manipulation could strip her of everything. To fall from favor meant exile, silence, or worse. Whispers tell of one principal wife accused of cursing a rival's child. The infant died suddenly, omens filled the palace, and soon she was sent away for health reasons. She never returned. Her story was erased from records, yet the shadow of her fate lingered. Even her personal life was wrapped in ritual. Some scholars believe she performed monthly bloodletting, cutting her tongue or ears to feed the gods in exchange for fertility. Every touch with the emperor carried ceremonial weight. Certain nights, dictated by the calendar and the movement of stars, were chosen for intimacy. Others were forbidden. A missed night might mean famine. A forbidden embrace could anger the gods. Nothing was spontaneous. Every union was political, spiritual, and cosmic. Still, despite the weight of duty, fragments of tenderness remain. One surviving poem describes an emperor weeping in his wife's arms after a failed campaign. His war crown lay crumpled at his feet while she soothed him. In that moment, power gave way to humanity. Beneath all the ceremony, there was still a man and a woman, bound together not just by ritual but by shared exhaustion. From her chambers, step into the grand courtyards where royal matchmaking took place. Here, marriages were not romances but strategies. Wars fought with gifts, dances, and arranged unions. Royal weddings often unfolded during week-long festivals. The palace courtyard became a stage lit with torches, drums beating beneath murals of eagles and serpents. Young noblewomen, painted and draped in feathers, paraded before priests, elders, and visiting lords. Each bride was a living offering, her body a treaty in flesh. The stakes were immense. A single match could end a war or doom an alliance. A bride's consent was rarely considered. Some were betrothed as children, their lives mapped out long before they could speak. At 14, they were deemed ready to marry, their youth equated with purity and divine favor. The wedding night itself often carried ritual supervision. A priestess or elder might oversee the consummation, ensuring that the act fulfilled its cosmic role. Herbs were given for stamina or pain relief. Two bodies merging symbolized more than love. It was the union of cities, temples, and gods. Afterward came feasts of dazzling display. Families paraded their new bonds with banquets of turkey, cacao, and dancers in turquoise masks. The newlyweds appeared before the crowds, glowing or exhausted, presented as proof of alliance. But even within this machinery of politics, human hearts rebelled. Some matches sparked real affection. Others turned bitter. Stories tell of a young bride who refused her husband because he smelled of maize. She was exiled, yet her defiance survived in song. Another tale speaks of a noblewoman who tried to flee with her true love, a musician, the night before her wedding. They were caught. He was sacrificed. She was entombed alive within a temple, her story preserved only in whispers. Women had little voice in these unions, but they found ways to resist. Some embroidered secret messages in cloth. Others delayed ceremonies or sought help from allies. Their defiance rarely changed the outcome, but it reminded the empire that even within cages, hearts still beat. By now, you see the pattern. The Aztec palace was less a home than a battlefield. Every union was a campaign, every embrace a negotiation, every pregnancy a matter of empire. Behind silk curtains and painted walls, love and power clashed endlessly. And as you walk deeper into the palace, past doors marked with silent notches, you reach a place where intimacy was inspected like state property. Here begins one of the most disturbing practices of all, the virginity inspections that sought to prove purity before a royal marriage could proceed. The corridor grows narrow, the air cooler. Gone are the gardens and torches. Instead, plain stone walls close in around you, each doorway marked with tiny carved notches. These are not decorations. They are warnings. You've entered the realm of inspections. Among the Aztec elite, purity was not a private matter. For brides marrying into the emperor's circle, virginity was a question of state. The belief was simple but merciless. A woman's untouched body carried divine energy. To preserve it until marriage was to protect her family's honor and the empire's sacred bloodline. To lose it too soon was to waste the gods' blessing. So before certain weddings, a ritual inspection was carried out. An elder midwife, sometimes accompanied by priestesses or noble witnesses, would examine the bride. Imagine that. The most vulnerable moment of your life transformed into a tribunal, with your body treated like a contract to be signed or torn apart. Not every woman faced this ordeal. Commoners were largely spared, but daughters of nobles, and especially those destined to marry into the emperor's household, had no escape. Their future, and often their family's standing, rested on what the midwife declared. The stakes were terrifying. If found dishonored, a woman could lose her dowry, her title, even her life. Families accused of deception faced public disgrace, sometimes punishment. Desperation led to deception. Stories spread of mothers bribing priestesses, or of young women cutting themselves elsewhere to mimic the signs expected on the wedding night. Virginity was not just a virtue. It was currency, and people would go to great lengths to protect it. One tale survives of a noble bride named Tenochtitlán who refused the inspection outright. When the midwife entered her chamber, Tenochtitlán stood firm and declared, "The gods see me. That is enough." Her father was powerful, and the marriage proceeded. But her name vanished from court records soon after. Some say she became a hidden advisor. Others believe she was quietly silenced. Her defiance, though, whispers across time as a rare moment of resistance. Historians disagree on how common these inspections were. Some say they were symbolic, exaggerated by Spanish chroniclers eager to depict the Aztecs as depraved. Others believe they were systematic, performed regularly among the nobility. The truth is likely in between. What is certain is that the fear of exposure shaped the lives of countless young women. Purity was not only tested through bodies. It was measured in dreams and symbols. Families claimed visions could reveal a daughter's state. Walking untouched through rain meant innocence, while a burning cornfield foretold shame. Virgin brides wore plain white cloaks, their hair parted simply. After marriage, their clothes changed to mark fertility, their old cloak kept as proof of transition. Even fabric carried the weight of expectation. And yet, this scrutiny was not applied equally. If a groom doubted his bride's virginity, he could demand an inquiry. Servants were questioned, parents interrogated. Sometimes the bride vindicated herself. Sometimes she could not. Men who lied faced punishment, but rarely as severe as the woman's. The double standard was clear. Women carried the burden of honor, while men carried the right to accuse. Leaving behind these chambers of judgment, you step into a wider hall where whispers rise like smoke. This is the heart of the royal harem, though the Aztecs had no single word for it. Dozens of wives, concubines, and noblewomen lived here, each with her own chamber, servants, and rank. To imagine this place as indulgent luxury would be a mistake. It was less a paradise than a battlefield of politics played with silken curtains instead of swords. Every smile carried suspicion. Every laugh could mask a curse. Each woman sought not just the emperor's affection, but his protection and favor for herself and her family. At the top of this hierarchy stood the Sewakotl, the principal wife you've already met. Beneath her were secondary wives, concubines, and unofficial lovers, rumored but never acknowledged. The system was layered like a stone pyramid, each level built upon the rivalries below. Life inside demanded cunning. Some concubines formed alliances with each other, watching children, sharing information, and plotting subtle moves to advance their sons. Others relied on gossip, the most dangerous weapon in the palace. To suggest a rival was sterile, unfaithful, or disrespectful to a god could end her standing overnight. Poison found its way into tamales. Curses were whispered over clay figurines. And sometimes, a single rumor spread at the right moment could erase a woman completely. Still, amid the rivalry, there was tenderness. Friendships blossomed. Women sang together at night, braided each other's hair, and mourned children lost to illness or ritual. Some bonds even turned to love. Fragments of oral tradition tell of two concubines from enemy regions who became secret lovers. They left small painted stones for one another beneath altars, tiny tokens of defiance against the empire's control. When one of them was executed for an unrelated crime, the other withdrew from palace life, her grief hidden but enduring. Their names were erased, but their story lived on in whispers. The emperor himself rarely interfered with this storm of rivalries. He did not need to. The women managed their own hierarchies, policing one another more efficiently than guards ever could. Some emperors were generous, granting lands and gifts to favored wives. Others remained distant, using intimacy only for ritual or political duty. Either way, the harem functioned as a self-contained world, with its own rules, its own dangers, and its own kind of power. Servants and attendants played an essential role in this hidden system. Chambermaids acted as confidants or spies, their loyalties bought with gifts or threatened by silence. A loyal servant could protect a concubine. A treacherous one could destroy her. Every whispered secret risked becoming currency in someone else's hands. Imagine a moonlit courtyard at the heart of this harem. A pool lies still and black, surrounded by reed mats and obsidian walls. Women once bathed here before ceremonies, their laughter echoing into the night. But alongside laughter came tears, hushed conversations, and silent schemes. For beneath the feathers and perfumes, these were women bound by duty, struggling within a system that demanded beauty, obedience, and perfection all at once. This was not just a collection of wives. It was a theater where the empire's fate was rehearsed in whispers and played out in beds. Every child born here was a potential heir, priest, or ambassador. Every alliance among wives shifted power at court, and every misstep could end in disgrace or death. As you leave the harem's tense corridors, the palace shifts again. The walls close tighter. The air grows heavier. Here lie the private quarters of the emperor's blood relatives, where the politics of marriage turned inward. Tonight, you're about to confront one of the empire's most unsettling truths, the practice of sibling unions, where royal blood was preserved by binding it to itself. The palace grows colder as you step into its most private chambers. Here, among carved benches and simple altars, the air feels heavy with secrets. These are the quarters of the emperor's closest kin, where the politics of bloodline became entangled with something rarely spoken aloud: marriages between siblings. To the Aztecs, this was not a matter of desire but of necessity. The emperor was more than a ruler. He was believed to be the living axis of the cosmos, a descendant of gods, his blood carrying a spark of the divine. Allowing that sacred essence to mingle freely with outsiders was considered dangerous. It risked diluting the power that bound the empire together. The solution, unsettling to us, was to keep the bloodline close, sometimes too close. Sibling and cousin marriages occurred at the highest levels, their purpose clear: preserve the sacred lineage, secure legitimacy, and prevent rival families from gaining influence through marriage ties. These unions were solemn, ceremonial, and intensely political. The bride might be a half-sister raised in another wing of the palace, groomed from childhood to fulfill her role as both sister and wife. To those outside the royal circle, such arrangements could seem disturbing. To the priests and nobles who sanctioned them, they were seen as cosmic necessities, a reenactment of divine unions told in myth. Not everyone agreed. Even then, whispers of unease circulated. Some nobles mocked the practice in poems or whispered satirical verses behind closed doors. Rivals used it as ammunition, painting the emperor's household as decadent or corrupt. Still, the marriages continued. because the stakes were too high. Better to bear scandal than to risk weakening the throne. Records were often deliberately vague. A bride's title might be listed as Lady of the Southern Wind or Daughter of the House of Akolua. Her relation to the emperor left unstated. Only when heirs were born and stability assured might the truth be quietly acknowledged. By then, it was too late for anyone to challenge the union. But not every sibling marriage ended smoothly. One story, half preserved in codices and oral tradition, tells of a princess named Xochitl forced to marry her elder half-brother, a high-ranking priest. She despised him, refusing to consummate the marriage. Disguised as a servant, she tried to flee the palace. She was caught. Her punishment exile to a temple of purification where she spent her life weaving sacred cloth. Her brother was reassigned, his name fading into obscurity. The empire erased their scandal, but the silence speaks volumes. Whether these marriages were rare or more common than records admit remains debated. Some scholars argue they became frequent in the empire's final decades, when legitimacy was under strain. Others suggest they were woven into royal tradition all along. What is certain is that these unions reveal how far the Aztec elite would go to preserve power, even bending the boundaries of family itself. But bloodlines alone could not sustain the empire. The Aztecs believed the world was a fragile machine fueled by offerings. And at the heart of those offerings lay one of the most unsettling truths. Sex and sacrifice were often intertwined. Fertility was not simply about children. It was about crops, rain, and survival. If the rains failed or the maize withered, entire cities could starve. In such moments, the empire turned not only to priests but to human bodies. Consorts, maidens, and chosen ones offered up in rituals that blurred the line between intimacy and death. In some ceremonies, a young man was selected to impersonate a god, Tezcatlipoca, Zyptotec, or another powerful deity. 4 weeks or months he lived as the god's vessel, honored, adorned in fine clothes, given women to share his bed. To outsiders, it might have seemed like privilege, but everyone knew how the story ended. At the climax of the festival, he was led to the temple, where his heart was cut out or his skin flayed, returning his borrowed divinity to the gods. The women chosen to lie with him were not simply lovers. They were participants in a cosmic drama. Their unions symbolized the earth embracing the sky, fertility awakening after drought, the cycle of life renewed. But they also knew that the man beside them would soon die, his pleasure transformed into sacrifice. Legends tell of one woman, remembered only as Yane, who fell in love with the god impersonator she was paired with. On the night before his sacrifice, she tried to flee with him into the forest. They were caught. He died on the temple stone. She was spared but marked as unclean, tattooed as a warning. She spent her life tending steam baths, never again allowed near sacred rites. Her name lingers only in songs, remembered as the woman who held the sun too tightly. Nor were such rituals limited to men. Women, too, were chosen as divine brides. A girl, often noble and young, was dedicated to the rain god Tlaloc or the goddess Xochiquetzal. Expected to remain pure until her final night, she would be ceremonially united with a priest or consort before being led to sacrifice. To the Aztecs, this was not cruelty. It was cosmic maintenance. The gods had given life through blood and desire, and humans were obliged to return the gift in kind. Spanish chroniclers, horrified, wrote lurid accounts of these rituals, framing them as proof of Aztec savagery. Yet even they admitted the devotion was real, that participants walked to their deaths not as victims but as offerings. Modern scholars debate whether the most graphic accounts were exaggerated. Still, enough evidence remains to show that for the Aztecs, sexuality was not a private indulgence. It was a sacred force, dangerous, powerful, and often demanded by the gods themselves. Now picture a temple staircase rising above the city, its steps stained with centuries of offerings. Flutes wail, drums beat like a second heartbeat, torches flicker against carved serpent heads. At the top, a man dressed as a guard embraces his final consort. Their union is not one of love, but of necessity. It is a prayer written in flesh, a plea to the heavens for rain, for life, for survival. When the sun rises, one of them will not see it. This was the reality of Aztec devotion. Fertility was not gifted freely. It was paid for, in sweat, in blood, in bodies given to the gods. And within this terrifying cycle, sex itself became both offering and weapon. As you leave the temple terraces in your mind's eye, the air shifts again. It grows sharper, electric, like the moment before a storm. Ahead lies one of the most secretive rites of all, the ceremonies of the jaguar priests, where desire, trance, and transformation merged into something even stranger. The temple steps fade behind you, replaced by a different kind of chamber, low, dark, and pulsing with sound. This is no public altar. It is the hidden domain of the jaguar priests, men who walked the line between holy and terrifying. Cloaked in spotted skins, their faces painted with obsidian stripes, they prowled through the night like hunters of both flesh and spirit. For the Aztecs, the jaguar was more than an animal. It was the embodiment of power, ferocity, and the underworld. To take on its essence was to command forces beyond the reach of ordinary men. The jaguar priests sought transformation not through warfare alone, but through ritual intoxication, mixtures of pulque, mushrooms, and hallucinogenic herbs that bent reality into shapes unseen. In the half-light of a temple cave, drums beat low while flutes shrieked. Priests crouched in circles, their bodies painted, their minds breaking open under sacred plants. And at the center, ritual partners, sometimes women, sometimes young men, were brought forward. What happened next blurred the line between trance and union, between possession and intimacy. To outsiders, it might have looked like madness, bodies writhing, chants rising, laughter turning to screams. But to the participants, it was communion with gods. The jaguar priests believed that through ritualized sex under trance, they could channel divine power. Their movements, their cries, even their breath carried meaning. In their altered minds, they were no longer men but jaguars, their partners no longer human but vessels of cosmic energy. Some scholars argue these ceremonies were exaggerated by Spanish friars eager to portray the Aztecs as demonic. Yet indigenous sources, rare and fragmented, hint at their reality. Fragments of song describe priests howling like beasts as they merged with partners, their bodies trembling as if devoured by something greater than themselves. One verse calls it, "the night when the jaguar enters the house of flesh." The partners chosen for these rites carried heavy burdens. Some were temple maidens, pledged to purity yet handed over to ceremonies that consumed their innocence. Others were young warriors, their initiation marked not by blood on the battlefield but by surrender to possession in the temple. Consent, as we understand it, had no place here. It was duty, an offering demanded by the gods through the voices of priests. Not all emerged alive. Some rites ended in sacrifice. The partner's body opened upon stone after the frenzy, their life given as fuel for the vision. Others lived but were forever changed, marked as touched by divine power. They might be revered, feared, or shunned, depending on how the community interpreted their fate. For the priests, these ceremonies were gateways. They claimed to travel into other worlds, to wrestle with spirits, to bring back omens of war or visions of harvest. Their sexual acts were not indulgence but transformation, moments where they ceased to be human and became bridges between realms. To them, pleasure was secondary. What mattered was power. Imagine standing in that cavern, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and chanting. Painted faces gleam in torchlight, eyes wild with visions. A priest grips his partner, not as a lover but as prey, his breath ragged, his movements animalistic. Around him, others sway, howl, collapse in convulsions. For hours the frenzy builds until dawn breaks, and silence falls like a shroud. On the floor, bodies lie still, some exhausted, others lifeless. And the priests rise, claiming to have touched the jaguar spirit, carrying new prophecies for the empire. These rites were not spoken of openly. They lived in whispers, in the margins of codices, in the terror of those who survived them. But their influence reached far. Leaders consulted the jaguar priests before campaigns, trusting their visions more than maps. Farmers prayed that the frenzy would bring rain. Even emperors bowed to their authority, for to deny the jaguar was to invite the wrath of the underworld. But alongside fear came fascination. The very danger of these rites gave them a lure. Some nobles sought initiation, believing it would grant them strength. Others sent their children as offerings, hoping their sacrifice would buy divine favor. The empire thrived on such exchanges, where human bodies became bargaining chips in negotiations with unseen forces. Spanish accounts, though dripping with disgust, preserve fragments of these stories. They describe naked bodies painted like beasts, partners chosen by lot, priests collapsing after nights of frenzy. Some friars insisted demons guided the rites. Others admitted, reluctantly, that the participants seemed genuinely convinced of their divine encounters. Whether seen as holy or heretical, the rituals left a mark too deep to erase. In the aftermath of conquest, many of these ceremonies vanished underground. Yet echoes survived in festivals, in whispered songs, and in folk practices that blurred Catholic saints with old gods. Even centuries later, the shadow of the jaguar lingered in villages, its roar heard not in the jungle but in dreams. What strikes us most is how differently the Aztecs understood the boundary between body and spirit. To them, intimacy was not always private, gentle, or consensual. It was often violent, transformative, and terrifying. It was a way to unmake oneself, to dissolve into something larger. Where we might see corruption, they saw communion. Where we might see violation, they saw sacrifice. Leaving the cave of the jaguar priests, you step back into the palace halls. The contrast is jarring. From animalistic frenzy to polished ritual, the Aztec world contained both extremes. And yet, both served the same purpose: to maintain balance between humans and gods, to keep the fragile universe spinning. Ahead lies another hall, quieter but no less strange. This is the realm of dream interpreters and healers, women who used sex, herbs, and visions to cure or curse. Here, intimacy took on another form, not frenzy, not politics, but medicine. In their hands, pleasure became remedy, and desire became a tool for healing or harm. The pounding drums of the jaguar priests fade, replaced by softer sounds, chants in low tones, the rattle of gourds, the hiss of steam rising from clay pots. You've entered another realm of Aztec life, the domain of healers and dream interpreters. Here, intimacy was not about politics or frenzy. It was about medicine, magic, and survival. The Aztecs believed illness was rarely just physical. To them, disease often meant imbalance between body, soul, and cosmos. Healers, known as Tenochtitlán, treated not only wounds and fevers but also curses, broken spirits, and troubled desires. Some were midwives, others were herbalists, and a few, the most feared, used sexuality itself as their tool of cure, or of curse. Step inside a dim room lined with gourds of herbs, roots, and powders. A young man lies shivering, fever burning his skin. The healer examines him, muttering prayers. She prescribes not only herbs, but a ritual union. A chosen woman is brought to his mat, perfumed with flowers and rubbed with oils. Their joining is meant to realign his energy, to drive out the sickness that has clung to him like a shadow. This may sound strange to us, but to the Aztecs, sexual medicine had logic. They believed the body carried tonali, a vital force tied to heat and energy. Illness could mean that force had been drained or disrupted. Through ritualized sex, energy might be restored. It was not always about pleasure. It was about survival. Midwives, too, wielded knowledge of both life and intimacy. They guided women through childbirth, cut umbilical cords with obsidian blades, and whispered prayers as new life entered the world. But they also carried secrets of contraception and abortion, taught quietly from elder to apprentice. Corn silk tea, cactus sap, and certain roots acted as preventatives. Stronger herbs could end unwanted pregnancies. Such practices were never written in codices, but passed from mouth to ear, hidden yet vital. Some midwives even served as matchmakers of a sort, advising families on sexual compatibility. They studied dreams, omens, and even the shape of a young woman's hips or the width of a man's shoulders to predict fertility. To them, union was not only sacred but practical, a matter of balancing humors and energies. But healing could just as easily turn to harm. Alongside the benevolent Tenochtitlan were the dark ones, the witches, the Tenochtitlán, who used desire to ensnare and destroy. Tales tell of women who seduced men only to sap their strength, leaving them wasted and weak. Others crafted clay dolls, binding them with strands of hair and drops of semen, then buried them beneath doorways to curse the guilty. One infamous story speaks of a nobleman who mocked a healer. That night, she came to him in a dream, seduced him, and vanished. When he awoke, his body was covered in sores. Within weeks, he was dead. His family burned his belongings, convinced he had been cursed by erotic witchcraft. Dreams played a powerful role in this world. The Aztecs believed the soul could leave the body during sleep, wandering other realms. To dream of intimacy with a stranger might foretell betrayal. To dream of lying with a goddess meant divine favor, and to dream of infidelity could invite real punishment, even if no act had been committed. Dreams were treated as truth, binding and dangerous. Healers often used sexual symbolism in curing dreams. If a woman dreamed of drowning, she might be instructed to unite with her husband at dawn, symbolically re-entering life. If a man dreamed of broken maize, he might be paired with a fertility ritual to restore his strength. These cures blurred the line between medicine and magic, body and spirit. The temazcal, or steam bath, was another space where sexuality and healing met. Inside these rounded stone huts, heated with volcanic rocks, people sweated out impurities while healers chanted. Couples sometimes entered together, guided by midwives who saw the steam bath as a womb of renewal. The heat, the sweat, the closeness. It was both cleansing and intimate, a place where new life could be symbolically reborn. Not all of this knowledge was celebrated. Some of it was feared, even condemned. Priests denounced certain practices as dangerous, accusing women healers of witchcraft. Yet families still sought them in secret, especially when official rituals failed. To many, these women were the last hope when crops failed, when children died, when love turned sour. Sexual healing also carried a political edge. A clever healer could gain influence by curing noble households of infertility, or by crafting charms to ensure loyalty in marriage. Some even claimed to control desire itself, creating potions to ignite passion or to extinguish it. These were not mere superstitions. In a world where alliances hinged on marriages and heirs, such powers were priceless and deadly. One surviving codex describes a potion brewed from cacao, chili, and certain ground insects. It was said to make a man burn with lust for whoever shared it with him. Another recipe, darker still, used crushed bones and obsidian dust to render a rival impotent. Whether they truly worked or not mattered less than belief. To fear such powers was to grant them reality. For ordinary people, love and healing often mingled in quieter ways. Couples sought blessings from local deities, offering flowers and copal before lying together in the fields. Farmers prayed to Tlaloc for rain and to Xochiquetzal for fertility in both crops and wombs. Sexual union, even outside the palace, was never entirely private. It was always part of a larger conversation with the gods. But healing had limits. Not every illness could be cured. Not every union restored balance. And when bodies failed, the Aztecs turned once again to sacrifice, believing that only blood could pay the debt. Pleasure might heal for a time, but death was the final medicine. As you leave the steam-filled chambers of the healers, you step back into the palace halls. The contrast is sharp, from whispered cures to roaring processions. Ahead lies the world of festivals, grand, dazzling, and terrifying. Here, intimacy was no longer hidden in shadows or whispers. It was displayed openly, woven into dances, songs, and ceremonies where the whole city watched. Step now into the streets of Tenochtitlan during a festival. The air is alive with smoke and color. Drums echo off the canals, flutes pierce the air, and thousands of voices rise in chants. Unlike the hidden chambers of healers or the secret caves of jaguar priests, this is spectacle. Intimacy displayed not behind curtains, but in front of the whole empire. Every month of the Aztec calendar carried its own great festival, each tied to a god, each demanding unique rituals. Some honored war, others rain, others fertility. All of them blended song, dance, and offerings. And many placed sexuality at the heart of performance. During the festival of Xochiquetzal, goddess of flowers, beauty, and desire, the city became a garden of living art. Young women paraded through streets draped in blossoms, their hair woven with ribbons, their faces painted with delicate patterns. They danced in circles, singing verses of love and longing. Men answered with songs of pursuit, moving in steps that mimicked courtship. The entire celebration was a living dialogue between attraction and restraint. But beneath the beauty lay darker rituals. A chosen maiden, representing the goddess herself, was kept pure for months. On the night of the climax, she was adorned with garlands, perfumed with copal, and united with a priest in a symbolic marriage. By dawn, she was sacrificed, her body offered as the final flower. To the people, her death ensured that beauty and fertility would bloom again. To her, it was the ultimate surrender. Other festivals were more explicit. The feast of Tlacaxipualistli, honoring Totec, the god of renewal, blended violence with erotic symbolism. Captives were dressed in skins, painted in red, and forced to dance mock battles. The priests wore the flayed skins of victims, their bodies slick and gleaming in the sun. To the Aztecs, this was not horror. It was rebirth, the shedding of old life for new. Yet the imagery of nakedness, blood, and flesh carried unmistakable undertones of sexuality. Even dances performed in public carried coded meanings. Men and women formed lines that curved and crossed, their steps mimicking pursuit, capture, and union. Some movements symbolized planting seeds in the earth, others the joining of sky and rain. To dance was to embody fertility itself, to turn the human body into ritual poetry. At night, the festivals grew wilder. Bonfires lit plazas, and masked dancers swirled around flames. Couples slipped into shadows, their embraces seen as extensions of the ritual. Intimacy during festivals was not shameful. It was expected, a way of aligning human pleasure with divine cycles. Children born 9 months later were considered gifts of the gods, proof that the ceremonies had succeeded. The Spaniards, watching these celebrations with foreign eyes, saw only sin. Chroniclers described shameless dances and lustful songs. They condemned the open expression of desire as depravity. Yet for the Aztecs, it was devotion. Desire was not hidden. It was sacred theater, reminding everyone that life itself depended on the union of forces. Music was central to this spectacle. The huetl drum, carved with jaguars and eagles, boomed like thunder. Shell trumpets wailed, their cries echoing across the lake. Rattles shaped like flowers shook in rhythm. The songs carried verses that spoke openly of longing, pleasure, and loss. Some were tender, praising the beauty of a beloved. Others were raw, mocking or playful, filled with double meanings. These songs were not whispered in bedrooms. They were shouted in plazas, making private emotions public art. Even costumes played a role. Feathered cloaks shimmered in the sun, each color tied to a deity. Masks turned dancers into gods, spirits, or animals. Some wore loincloths embroidered with fertility symbols, their bodies painted with spirals that hinted at creation. The audience was not passive. They joined in chants, laughed at bawdy verses, and wept at tragic songs. Festivals turned the city into one vast stage where desire and devotion mingled. Yet festivals also carried risk. Too much passion could spill into disorder. Priests watched closely, ensuring that ritual never descended into chaos. Certain acts were permitted only on specific nights. Others were punished severely if carried out at the wrong time. The Aztecs knew that desire was powerful, so powerful it needed boundaries, rituals, and sacrifices to contain it. One story tells of a festival where two nobles quarreled over a dancer. Their fight turned bloody, disrupting the ceremony. The priests declared it an omen. To restore balance, both men were executed, their deaths offered to the god of fire. The dancer herself was dedicated to a temple, her beauty considered too dangerous to remain free. Such tales remind us that while the festivals celebrated pleasure, they also demanded discipline. For common people, festivals were rare chances to break free of daily struggles. Farmers, artisans, and merchants all joined, drinking pulque, laughing, singing, and sometimes finding lovers among strangers. These unions, fleeting or lasting, carried no shame. They were seen as gifts of the gods, temporary blessings born under the gaze of sacred ceremony. But for nobles, the stakes were higher. Their behavior was scrutinized. A careless embrace could become gossip, a misstep in a dance interpreted as insult. Even in joy, politics never disappeared. For a princess or prince, every glance carried meaning. Every touch could shift alliances. Pleasure and power remained inseparable. Still, amid all the politics and ritual, there were moments of genuine human joy. Imagine a young couple stealing away during the Feast of Flowers, their laughter hidden behind painted masks. Or a widowed woman dancing freely for the first time in years, her body moving with abandon under torchlight. These small rebellions remind us that even within rigid systems, people found ways to claim desire for themselves. The festivals of Tenochtitlán dazzled the senses and stirred the heart. They turned the city into a theater of devotion, where intimacy became spectacle and spectacle became survival. And yet, when the fires died and the songs ended, the palace still awaited, its halls heavy with intrigue. As the crowds dispersed and the torches dimmed, another layer of Aztec sexuality emerges, one even more hidden, whispered only in the darkest corners of the city. These were the tales of forbidden loves, same-sex unions, and secret transgressions. In the next hall, the air grows tense again, for desire outside the accepted order carried both passion and peril. The torches of the festival fade, and the air of Tenochtitlan grows heavier. The music, the laughter, the perfume of flowers, all dissolve into whispers. You've stepped into the hidden side of Aztec desire, the realm of forbidden loves. Here, passion was not celebrated but condemned, and to walk this path was to risk disgrace, punishment, even death. The Aztec world was bound tightly by laws. Marriage linked families, heirs carried bloodlines, and unions served gods as much as people. To stray outside those rules was not simply personal rebellion. It was seen as a threat to the order of the cosmos. And yet, desire does not obey decrees. Beneath the gaze of priests and elders, secret loves bloomed in shadow. Among the most dangerous were same-sex unions. The official stance was harsh. Codices describe punishments ranging from public humiliation to execution. Men accused of lying with men could be strangled or burned. Women caught with women were sometimes mutilated or cast out. The laws declared such unions an offense against the gods, a disruption of fertility and balance. But law and life are not always the same. Beneath the surface, same-sex love existed. Quiet, disguised, but real. Fragments of Nawa poetry speak of friends of the night, who shared blankets, of women who exchanged flowers as tokens of devotion. Some accounts describe warriors who formed bonds so deep they blurred into intimacy, fighting side by day and sharing mats by night. To outsiders, these might appear as comradeship. To those within, it may have meant something more. One whispered tale tells of two noble youths who loved each other in secret. They met at night in the gardens, their trysts hidden among the reeds. When they were discovered, one was executed, his body thrown into the lake. The other was forced into marriage, but he refused his wife, living the rest of his life in silence. His sorrow became legend, retold in hushed tones as a warning, and as a remembrance of a love too dangerous for its time. Women, too, found forbidden paths. Midwives and healers, who often lived apart from men, formed close bonds with one another. Some stories tell of women who vowed never to marry, choosing instead the companionship of another woman. Their devotion was disguised as spiritual duty, but within their chambers they lived as partners. These unions rarely left records, but traces survive in the gossip recorded by Spanish friars who marveled at such defiance. Cross-dressing also unsettled the empire's order. During festivals, some men donned women's garments, painting their faces and dancing in roles meant for maidens. Sometimes this was ritual, meant to honor gods of duality. But sometimes it was personal expression, a way of living outside assigned roles. The punishments for such acts could be brutal, yet people continued to take the risk. To them, identity was not always a prison. It was a possibility. Desire between classes was another forbidden path. A noblewoman seen with a commoner risked more than scandal. She risked her family's honor, her own life, and his as well. Yet stories abound of princesses sneaking from the palace at night to meet lovers in the marketplace, disguised in plain cloaks. One legend tells of a royal daughter who fell for a singer. When their affair was uncovered, he was sacrificed to the gods, his heart cut out before a crowd. She was forced into marriage with a foreign ally, but she carried a hidden pendant carved from his flute, a secret token of love never forgotten. Even adultery between nobles was a crime beyond forgiveness. Men and women caught in the act could be stoned or strangled. Yet affairs persisted. Some used servants as messengers, slipping gifts or notes. Others met in abandoned temples or in the fields during festivals. To succeed meant stolen moments of passion. To fail meant ruin. One chronicler records a grim example. A high-ranking official discovered in bed with another man's wife. They were dragged through the streets, mocked, and executed. Their bodies were left for vultures. To the empire, their deaths were not cruelty but cleansing, a way to restore cosmic balance broken by lust. And yet, despite the danger, forbidden loves persisted. Why? Perhaps because repression breeds longing. Perhaps because human hearts refuse to bow completely to law. In the silences of night, in whispered songs, in secret touches, people carved out small rebellions against a system that demanded absolute obedience. We must remember that even in a society as disciplined as the Aztecs, desire could not be fully controlled. Behind masks of duty, behind rigid ceremonies, people still sought connection. Some succeeded quietly, their secrets never revealed. Others paid dearly. All left shadows in history, faint but undeniable. The Spaniards, upon learning of these forbidden loves, seized them as evidence of sin. They painted the Aztecs as both decadent and brutal, condemning same-sex unions as proof of corruption. But what they could not see was that these loves were not signs of weakness. They were signs of humanity, fragile, stubborn, enduring even against impossible odds. Imagine for a moment two lovers meeting in secret, perhaps two young men, warriors hiding their tenderness in the barracks, perhaps two women, midwives who share dreams in the steam bath, perhaps a noble and a commoner, hands brushing in the marketplace. Each knows the risk. Each knows discovery means ruin. And yet they reach for one another, because the heart does not ask permission. Leaving behind these whispers of forbidden desire, you step once more into the palace halls. Ahead, the air grows colder still. The Spaniards are arriving, their banners bright, their eyes sharp. With them will come new laws, new judgments, and new violence. The world you've walked through, of festivals, harems, healers, and secret loves, is about to collide with conquest. The whispers of forbidden loves fade as the sound of distant drums shifts into something harsher. Boots on stone, foreign voices echoing across the lake. The Spaniards have come. Their banners flap above Tenochtitlán, bright against the sky, carrying the weight of a world about to end. For the Aztecs, intimacy had always been sacred, disciplined, and bound to cosmic duty. But for the Spaniards, sexuality carried a different code, one shaped by Catholic morality, by shame, by rigid laws of sin and confession. The clash of these two visions was brutal. At first, the Spaniards watched with horror. They recorded festivals filled with flowers and dances as immoral orgies. They condemned midwives who taught contraception, branding them as witches. They sneered at nobles who kept multiple wives, dismissing them as pagan lust. What the Aztecs saw as devotion to gods, the conquerors labeled as depravity. And yet, even as they judged, the Spaniards indulged. Soldiers took women as spoils of war, seizing them from villages, temples, even noble households. Concubines were forced upon conquistadors, sometimes given as gifts by local rulers desperate to secure alliances. The hypocrisy was staggering. They denounced Aztec customs as sinful, while committing violence in the name of conquest. The most infamous example was La Malinche, the Nahua woman who became Hernán Cortés's interpreter, advisor, and lover. To some, she was a victim, traded into his bed as part of negotiations. To others, she was a strategist, wielding intimacy as her only weapon of survival. Through her, two worlds communicated, but through her also flowed betrayal, longing, and a bond that history still debates. Was she a captive, a collaborator, or both? Her story shows how intimacy became a battlefield in itself. The Spaniards imposed new laws swiftly. Polygamy was outlawed. Concubines were cast out. Nobles who once commanded harems were forced into single marriages, their networks of alliances shattered. Women who had wielded quiet influence as secondary wives suddenly found themselves discarded, stripped of power and security. Some were remarried under Catholic rites. Others were abandoned entirely, left to beg or serve in Spanish households. Sexual punishments grew harsher. The Spaniards targeted same-sex unions with particular fury, calling them sodomy, and punishing them with fire. Records tell of indigenous men executed by burning, their deaths meant to erase practices the Spaniards deemed unnatural. The Aztec acceptance of duality, of gods who embodied both male and female traits, was suppressed. A culture that had once woven fluidity into its myths was forced into rigid European binaries. Women suffered most in the collision. Many became victims of forced unions with Spanish men. Some bore children who would become the first mestizos, symbols of both hope and trauma. These children embodied the merging of two worlds, yet their existence was born from conquest, not choice. For their mothers, intimacy became a wound carved into their very bodies. The Spaniards also attacked the healers. Midwives and herbalists who once guided births and taught contraception were branded as witches. Steam baths were condemned as dens of lust. Erotic songs were silenced. Codices that recorded fertility rites were burned in great pyres. Their knowledge turned to ash. Entire traditions of sexual medicine vanished, surviving only in fragments whispered in secret. Yet not everything was destroyed. Some practices endured in disguise. Herbal contraceptives continued to be passed among women, hidden behind Catholic prayers. Festivals survived, but their songs were rewritten to honor saints instead of gods. Masks, dances, and rituals carried echoes of older meanings, even when stripped of their original names. Beneath the surface, the old ways smoldered, waiting. The Spaniards' conquest reshaped intimacy not only through violence but through silence. Desire became something to confess, a sin to be punished. Where the Aztecs had sung openly of longing, the colonizers demanded secrecy. Where the Aztecs had tied sex to cosmic duty, the Spaniards tied it to guilt. What had once been sacred theater became private shame. Still, human resilience found cracks in the system. Indigenous women learned to navigate Spanish households, using their positions to protect families or secure inheritances for children. Some concubines turned wives, gaining unexpected power through legal recognition. Others resisted quietly, keeping the songs of Xochiquetzal alive in lullabies or weaving forbidden symbols into textiles. The Spaniards, for all their zeal, could not erase memory completely. Beneath the surface of colonial life, stories persisted, of jaguar priests, of secret loves, of women who healed with herbs and touch. They lingered in folklore, in gossip, in the fears of Catholic priests who complained that the old sins continued in secret. The clash of sexual norms was not just about intimacy. It was about power. By reshaping who could love, who could marry, and who could bear children, the Spaniards rewrote the structure of Aztec society itself. Whole networks of alliances collapsed. Women who once held influence became dependent. Men who once commanded respect were reduced to peasants under colonial rule. And yet, desire endured. Even under conquest, people still found ways to love in secret, to touch, to dream. Just as they had before, they defied laws with whispers and glances. The forbidden loves of old found new forms in the shadows of colonial rule. Picture Tenochtitlán after conquest. The temples are toppled, crosses rise above the ruins, and foreign bells toll across the lake. Yet in a quiet corner, a woman hums an old fertility song as she nurses her child. In a back room, a healer crushes herbs, passing knowledge from mother to daughter. In the darkness, two lovers meet, risking punishment for a moment of tenderness. The Spaniards may have conquered the city, but they could not fully conquer the heart. As you leave these broken streets in your imagination, one last chamber awaits. It is not a palace hall or a temple, but the silence of memory itself. In this final space, we see what survived, what was lost, and what still lingers in the shadows of history. The temple steps fade behind you, replaced by a different kind of chamber, low, dark, and pulsing with sound. This is no public altar. It is the hidden domain of the jaguar priests, men who walked the line between holy and terrifying, cloaked in spotted skins, their faces painted with obsidian stripes. They prowled through the night like hunters of both flesh and spirit. For the Aztecs, the jaguar was more than an animal. It was the embodiment of power, ferocity, and the underworld. To take on its essence was to command forces beyond the reach of ordinary men. The jaguar priests sought transformation not through warfare alone but through ritual intoxication, mixtures of pulque, mushrooms, and hallucinogenic herbs that bent reality into shapes unseen. In the half-light of a temple cave, drums beat low while flutes shrieked. Priests crouched in circles, their bodies painted, their minds breaking open under sacred plants. And at the center, ritual partners, sometimes women, sometimes young men, were brought forward. What happened next blurred the line between trance and union, between possession and intimacy. To outsiders, it might have looked like madness. Bodies writhing, chants rising, laughter turning to screams. But to the participants, it was communion with gods. The jaguar priests believed that through ritualized sex under trance, they could channel divine power. Their movements, their cries, even their breath carried meaning. In their altered minds, they were no longer men but jaguars, their partners no longer human but vessels of cosmic energy. Some scholars argue these ceremonies were exaggerated by Spanish friars eager to portray the Aztecs as demonic. Yet indigenous sources, rare and fragmented, hint at their reality. Fragments of song describe priests howling like beasts as they merged with partners, their bodies trembling as if devoured by something greater than themselves. One verse calls it, "the night when the jaguar enters the house of flesh." The partners chosen for these rites carried heavy burdens. Some were temple maidens, pledged to purity yet handed over to ceremonies that consumed their innocence. Others were young warriors, their initiation marked not by blood on the battlefield but by surrender to possession in the temple. Consent, as we understand it, had no place here. It was duty, an offering demanded by the gods through the voices of priests. Not all emerged alive. Some rites ended in sacrifice. The partner's body opened upon stone after the frenzy, their life given as fuel for the vision. Others lived but were forever changed, marked as touched by divine power. They might be revered, feared, or shunned, depending on how the community interpreted their fate. For the priests, these ceremonies were gateways. They claimed to travel into other worlds, to wrestle with spirits, to bring back omens of war or visions of harvest. Their sexual acts were not indulgence but transformation, moments where they ceased to be human and became bridges between realms. To them, pleasure was secondary. What mattered was power. Imagine standing in that cavern, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and chanting. Painted faces gleam in torchlight, eyes wild with visions. A priest grips his partner, not as a lover but as prey, his breath ragged, his movements animalistic. Around him, others sway, howl, collapse in convulsions. For hours the frenzy builds until dawn breaks, and silence falls like a shroud. On the floor, bodies lie still, some exhausted, others lifeless. And the priests rise, claiming to have touched the jaguar spirit, carrying new prophecies for the empire. These rites were not spoken of openly. They lived in whispers, in the margins of codices, in the terror of those who survived them. But their influence reached far. Leaders consulted the jaguar priests before campaigns, trusting their visions more than maps. Farmers prayed that the frenzy would bring rain. Even emperors bowed to their authority, for to deny the jaguar was to invite the wrath of the underworld. But alongside fear came fascination. The very danger of these rites gave them a lure. Some nobles sought initiation, believing it would grant them strength. Others sent their children as offerings, hoping their sacrifice would buy divine favor. The empire thrived on such exchanges, where human bodies became bargaining chips in negotiations with unseen forces. Spanish accounts, though dripping with disgust, preserve fragments of these stories. They describe naked bodies painted like beasts, partners chosen by lot, priests collapsing after nights of frenzy. Some friars insisted demons guided the rites. Others admitted, reluctantly, that the participants seemed genuinely convinced of their divine encounters. Whether seen as holy or heretical, the rituals left a mark too deep to erase. In the aftermath of conquest, many of these ceremonies vanished underground. Yet echoes survived in festivals, in whispered songs, and in folk practices that blurred Catholic saints with old gods. Even centuries later, the shadow of the jaguar lingered in villages, its roar heard not in the jungle but in dreams. What strikes us most is how differently the Aztecs understood the boundary between body and spirit. To them, intimacy was not always private, gentle, or consensual. It was often violent, transformative, and terrifying. It was a way to unmake oneself, to dissolve into something larger. Where we might see corruption, they saw communion. Where we might see violation, they saw sacrifice. Leaving the cave of the jaguar priests, you step back into the palace halls. The contrast is jarring. From animalistic frenzy to polished ritual, the Aztec world contained both extremes. And yet, both served the same purpose: to maintain balance between humans and gods, to keep the fragile universe spinning. Ahead lies another hall, quieter but no less strange. This is the realm of dream interpreters and healers, women who used sex, herbs, and visions to cure or curse. Here, intimacy took on another form. Not frenzy, not politics, but medicine. In their hands, pleasure became remedy, and desire became a tool for healing or harm.